History will record that the first time a sitting U.S. president attended Supreme Court oral arguments to watch what would happen to a centerpiece of his agenda, it was a monumental disaster for that president. That's what happened when Donald Trump went to the Supreme Court on Wednesday to witness how the justices would handle his purported birthright citizenship ban, which has been slapped down by every lower court that has heard it. And judging from the questions by the justices, is headed for the same fate at the Supreme Court. And I know by now you have probably heard all the predictions. Maybe you're skeptical of it, as you should be. The ruling isn't out yet. We'll probably hear from the justices again sometime this summer, but it's not looking good for Trump. But what does it mean that Trump went to the Supreme Court to attend these oral arguments? And if everything goes as the legal community believes it is going, he's going to fail, not by a close margin, but by a lopsided one. Here to discuss that question and other issues in the wake of that hearing is Andrea Flores. She is a former White House and Department of Homeland Security attorney during the Obama administration and an immigration expert who watched the proceedings as well. Andrea, thank you very much for joining All Rise News and Legal AF.
Thanks for having me.
So, do you agree with the basic proposition, the premise that it looks like Trump is going to lose and it's not going to be close?
I do agree. I mean, it didn't seem that most of the conservative justices really agreed with their interpretation of birthright citizenship and the citizenship clause. So he got tough questions. I was surprised that John Sauer couldn't answer some very predictable questions and how much he relied on very old arguments around birthright citizenship. We're talking like 1860s to try and justify this very extreme executive order. So I do agree that it looked very bad for the president, and it's probably why he left the courtroom early. That was he was sitting there, but then he left. So that says a lot.
I think it says a lot too. And let's unpack that a little bit. Why do you think he went to court?
So it's so interesting to me because a lot of people sometimes try and separate President Trump from his like extreme immigration agenda, right? They'll blame it on AIDS. They'll talk about Stephen Miller. They'll talk about Tom Homan, and they'll say, Trump doesn't love this immigration stuff, but it is so significant that the first case he decided to go and sit in front of the justices on is birthright citizenship, one of his most extreme fringe actions that came out the first day of his presidency. So this to me showed he really cares about this case and this decision and how it goes. And he sees it, as you said, central to his agenda. So I hope it really dispels the myth that he isn't all in on very extreme anti-immigration politics. As a matter of fact, he is breaking big norms to actually try and, in fact, maybe intimidate the justices to go in his direction.
This wasn't one of the cases where he's dragged kicking and screaming by Stephen Miller. You're absolutely right. He's fully on board. And on the intimidation question, this was the first time he's in court. He chose this one. And does it send the message, I'm watching you? After we saw on Monday, he's calling the Supreme Court justices dumb. What do you make of the intimidation question?
It's part of a long pattern of him as president threatening judges, calling them, dumb or biased, or saying that they're picking winners or losers, all very inappropriate remarks that led to Justice John Roberts at one point saying, this intimidation of the federal courts is dangerous. And so I had worked on a bill to help increase security for the federal judiciary. It's called the Daniel Anderl Judicial Security Act, and that passed in the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act. And that bill meant to create new privacy rights for federal judges to protect them from such an intense increase in threats. And it was named after Daniel Anderl, who's the son of Judge Esther Salas, a federal judge in New Jersey. He was murdered by an aggrieved plaintiff who appeared before Judge Salas. And so that just shows the kind of environment we're in right now, where when the president of the United States is calling judges dumb, that increases, their risks across the board.
And obviously, the justices are aware of it. Trump had attacked them 2 days before the hearing began. And here they are, pretty much down the line, asking very tough questions. I think even Clarence Thomas at one point challenged them on the sort of disconnect that their interpretation of the 14th Amendment would have on state versus federal citizenship. Do you think that if there was that effort, it failed?
I think it did fail. They seemed to proceed normally and they asked hard questions. And I hope President Trump noted that his Solicitor General couldn't answer them, right? I wonder if he gets displeased with Sauer at some point, just based on his record of getting frustrated with his own team. But Clarence Thomas, his first question, as you said, was a tough one. It was essentially, why would you want to disrupt this scheme that happened post the Civil War that assured that states didn't have different definitions of who could become a citizen, and it was all brought under one, where no matter where you're born in the United States, you are a citizen. That's what the citizenship clause is supposed to regulate. And Thomas just came out right away and stated that, and Sauer didn't really have a coherent response.
Right. And one of the things that was very striking me, of course, I heard the same thing you did about Trump leaving the courtroom in the middle of the arguments, apparently, perhaps because it wasn't going well for him. But there wasn't a moment where there was an acknowledgement. The questions came one after the other, and it seemed to have proceeded as though he was never in the room.
You couldn't tell, right? And I think obviously there's been debates in the past about whether these oral arguments should be televised. And it was really interesting in this era we're in the media where so much is on video that we actually couldn't see any reactions or how it impacted things. I've heard anecdotes that, the room grew silent when he came in, but that seemed to be the only big shift that happened. And then arguments just proceeded. And I couldn't tell from hearing either of the lawyers either arguing the case that it was throwing them off either.
Absolutely. And I should be clear, we don't know the reasons why he left the courtroom. We don't know anything other than what we are hearing from the reports of the people who were inside, which is an argument for cameras in the courtroom. Do you think that the reception during this oral argument will make Trump question whether he visits again?
It's a good question. I mean, to your point, I also very much support televised Supreme Court hearings because it's so important that the public engages with the highest court in the land on these huge questions that could shape our society going forward. So it's an argument for. I wonder, we're just based on anecdotes on how it impacted the room, but there's questions to your point of why he left, what he heard, at what point did he leave. I think the public sort of deserves to know more of that.
Absolutely. What do you think this will mean if this goes in the way that people expect, that it's not only Trump's position being defeated, but defeated handily? How does that go toward Trump's relationship to the court and the public's perception of it?
Well, this executive order, just so people understand the history of it, is that it really gained traction, this idea that immigrants here in temporary status should not be subject to the 14th Amendment and to the Citizenship Clause had been a very fringe legal theory post the Civil Rights Act, post the Immigration Nationality Act, when Congress eliminated racial quotas, right? So then people developed these new arguments that targeted birthright citizenship, but nobody took them seriously in either party. Until President Trump came along in his second term, he turned that fringe argument into an executive order. And why I give you that history is that it would be a real rebuke to some of his most extreme supporters who maybe believed something that most Americans don't, which is that the Constitution is unclear on an issue that it actually expressly says in text that anyone born in the United States is an American. And so my fear, went in a different direction and he won this case, it would open up a whole new set of questions about executive authority and the ability to just writ large reinterpret amendments, the very text of the Constitution. I don't think it will go that way, but it will be a rebuke to some of his intense overreach. I mean, it was so bold of him to say, I'm going to ignore the entire way that anyone else has to amend the Constitution, which requires going to all the states and having them vote on changing amendment text. And he's just trying to do it with executive order. And this might be about immigration, but that's a big piece of what he's testing here. And so it will really show the Supreme Court can check his power.
Right. And I wonder if the Roberts Court in particular, Chief Justice Roberts, sees this as sort of a win-win here. This is such a fringe theory that he can say, oh, we're just calling the shots here on a rather easy call that the 14th Amendment means what it says. And in the very near future, potentially rule in Trump's favor in equally significant, well, maybe not equally, but very significant immigration decisions that affect hundreds of thousands of people.
It's interesting because while I think the justices will side against Trump in this case, they have sided with the administration on some pretty big decisions around temporary protected status, where they've used their shadow docket to essentially allow the administration to strip legal status from hundreds and thousands, over 400,000 Venezuelans who had a temporary legal status, which is a protection that gives people the ability to work because they cannot return to their home country for different reasons. And so there's a case that the court accepted and required arguments on coming up later this month that will ask the question, can the court actually review the administration's decisions to terminate TPS, temporary legal status? And that is around Haitians. There's over 300,000 people, and Syrians around a little under 10,000. But that's a lot of people who the court could decide that the administration can go ahead and strip their legal status. And that will be really a monumental decision too, because it means that all of a sudden the undocumented population will grow by the hundreds of thousands. And depending on what they decide, it could apply to every TPS group, which equals over 1 million people could then become undocumented. So they may give them a win on birthright, but I think there's this fear that around temporary protected status, they'll do something also that is actually quite extreme. No one has advocated for TPS to not be able to be reviewed by the courts when it is terminated. So I think it's all about strategy for Roberts, how he wants to approach these two decisions. But to me, they're both deeply concerning for how our society is shaped. Just the idea of that overnight, over 1 million people could be undocumented is something we haven't experienced.
And to underline that point again, because this is coming to a head very soon, I believe we spoke about this in a different show on this channel. This temporary protected status case, this affects hundreds of thousands of people who are fleeing natural disasters. In Haiti, it's the earthquake. In Syria, it's war. And that's the very purpose of this program. And these are people who, in many instances, have built their lives in the United States over the course of a decade or longer. And the stakes, correct me if I'm wrong, is whether those people, the hundreds of thousands, will suddenly have the rug pulled from them and be stripped of their legal protections.
That's exactly right. I mean, it will be earth-shattering in the space because these are people who've come forward. They've been vetted. They're actually the most vetted population in our immigration system because they have to come forward every 18 months. And we've had people in that process since the 1990s. And we have El Salvadorians and Nicaraguans who have been here since the 1990s who would lose their status, even though they've been complying. They're some of the most, if we care about public safety and national security, this is the population of immigrants you should be more protective of because they're just following all of our rules and could be punished for it.
Right. And I guess the running theme here is that we shouldn't be under any misimpression that this still isn't a very deeply, deeply conservative court, but this is a particular decision where such a fringe legal theory based on what we both saw appears to be headed to the dustbin. Is that a fair thing?
I think it's a fair statement. I feel better after listening to oral arguments, and I think that's where we're headed.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for joining All Rise News.
Thank you.
And for folks who want to find out more about this and other topics, visit www.allrisenews.com or All Rise News on Substack and take a moment right now to subscribe to Legal AF.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.